His Holiness Bhaktivedanta Sadhu Swami. And in the end, there was His Holiness Kriyananda Das Goswami and Murali Gopal Prabhu.
Я вижу, Бхактивидян Госвами окошко есть.
Да, сейчас он подойдет.
Хорошо, подойдет. Поэтому, дорогие друзья, давайте мы несколько слов скажем о программе.
So we will tell about today's program.
О ее распорядке. То есть традиционно, как вы помните,
as you remember, traditionally every day our conference starts from Shrimad Bhagavatam class.
И о том, кто сегодня будет его проводить, я расскажу немного позже, буквально через минуту. Затем в 10 часов
And then at 10 o'clock we'll have
пленарное заседание,
speeches.
доклады сегодняшнего дня представляют собой доклады 4
There will be 4 participants. They will be till lunch. And at 1:30 on Moscow time, we'll have reports of lectures, conference participants and members of Bhaktivedanta institutes.
Сейчас, я не знаю, слушает ли нас уважаемый Бхактивидана Госвами Махараджа. И пока я скажу несколько слов о нашем ведущем Шримад Бхагаватам.
I will tell a little bit about our lecturer of Shrimad Bhagavatam class, Bhaktivedanta Goswami Maharaj. He is well known to everyone.
Безусловно, но все же мне хочется сказать несколько слов о Махараджи и представить его святейшество гостям нашей конференции. Духовный лидер, монах-саньяси.
He is a spiritual leader, sannyasi, disciple of Radhanath Goswami Maharaj, and first initiating guru in Russian ISKCON.
Его святейшество чрезвычайно разносторонняя личность.
His Holiness is quite a diverse personality. He knows philosophy and history, psychology deeply. He also well versed in languages. He speaks English and studies Sanskrit, Bengali, Hindi. He is the author of many books and poems, lectures and seminars. His lectures are very deep and often paradoxical.
Произведение Александра Сергеевича Пушкина, совершенно не случайно, и гений парадоксов друг. На самом деле, я всегда об этом думаю, когда слушаю лекции.
When I hear of lectures of Bhaktivedanta Goswami Maharaj, I always remember one verse which says that genius is a friend of paradoxes.
От Совета по общественным наградам Российской Федерации.
He also have awards from Russian government. He is also a chemist and has a degree in chemistry.
И, безусловно, дорогой Махарадж, можно договориться о регламенте, прежде чем я предоставлю вам слово. То есть получается, что у вас есть 50 минут, и затем 10 минут на вопросы и ответы. Спасибо большое. Необычайно рады вас видеть, и с нетерпением ждем то, что вы нам скажете. Спасибо.
Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya.
Om Namo
Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. Narayanam Namaskritya Naram Chaiva Narottamam. Третий. Девим Сарасватим Ясам Тато Джаямудирае Наштапраешвабадрешу Нитям Бхагавата Севая Бхагаватютама Шлоке Бхактирбхавати Наштики Ям правраджантам анупетам апета критьям двайпаяно вирахакатара аджухава путрети танмаятайо тараво винедус там сарвабута хридаям муниманатосми. Харе Кришна, я очень рад, что у меня есть такая возможность.
I'm so glad to have this opportunity and to address you all. Originally, I wanted to speak about logical argument, logical necessity of God's existence, according to the 35th verse from the 7th chapter of 2nd canto, but then I decided to speak about something more practical. Taking the statement in the purport of Srila Prabhupada's purport, this verse is the topic for scientific study. This verse is so we'll speak about the verse is potential basis for vast research.
Это определение, которое дает функциям эфира врити лакшанам, функциям первого материального элемента.
It is about
26 главе 3 песни Shrimad Bhagavatam,
26th chapter of 3rd canto.
Antaram eva cha pranendriyatma dishnatvam nabaso vriti lakshanam. Функции и признаки эфира заключаются в том, что он предоставляет место для внешнего и внутреннего бытия
inner and external existence of all living beings. So this is the field of
Чидра дартритвам, буквально он дает некое пространство для того,
it gives the space for living entities.
Жить здесь, как внутреннего, так и внешнего, бахирантар.
This is the 34th verse. The activities and characteristics of the ethereal element can be observed as the accommodation of room for the external and internal existences of all living entities, namely the field of activities of the vital air, the senses, and the mind. And the purport is, the mind, the senses, and the vital force or living entity have forms, although they are not visible to the naked eye. Form rests in subtle existence in the sky, and internally it is perceived as the veins within the body and the circulation of the vital air. Externally, there are invisible forms of sense objects. The production of the invisible sense objects is the external activity of the ethereal element, and the circulation of vital air and blood is its internal activity. That subtle forms exist in the ether has been proven by modern science by transmission of television, by which forms of photographs of one place are transmitted to another place by the action of the ethereal element. That is very nicely explained here. The production of the invisible sense objects is the external activity of the ethereal element, and the circulation of vital air and blood is its internal activity. This is the key sentence. That is very nicely explained here. This verse is the potential basis of great scientific research work, for it explains how subtle forms are generated from the ethereal element, what their characteristics and actions are, and how the tangible elements, namely air, fire, water, and earth, are manifested from the subtle form.
Как действуют и как из тонкой формы образуются воспринимаемые чувствами элементы: воздух, огонь, вода, земля.
Mental activities or psychological actions of thinking, feeling, and willing are also activities on the platform of ethereal existence. The statement in Bhagavad Gita that the mental situation at the time of death is the basis of the next birth is also corroborated in this verse. Mental existence transforms into tangible form as soon as there is an opportunity due to the contamination or development of the gross elements from subtle form.
Преобразуется в грубую форму, воспринимаемую чувствами. Как только в результате осквернения из тонкой формы образуются грубые элементы. Шрила Прабхупада ки джай. Бутанам чидра дартритвам бахирантар антарамева ча пранендриятма. The
activities and characteristics of the ethereal element can be observed as the accommodation of room for the external and internal existences of all living entities, namely the field of activities of the vital air, the senses, and the mind.
Namo Vishnu Padaya Krishna Prasthaya Bhutale Shrimad Bhaktivedanta Swami Vidjnana Namaste Saraswati Devi Gauravani Pracharini Nirvishesha Shunyavadi Panchakalpatarudescha Kripa Sindhu Devacha Patitanam Pavanebhyo Vaishnavebhyo Namo Jai Shri Krishna Chaitanya Prabhu Nityananda Shri Advaita Gadadhara Shivasadi Gaura Bhakta Vrinda Hare Krishna 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 Hare 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 Rama Rama Rama.
I will tell a little about this concept, which is in the basis of this verse from Shrimad Bhagavatam. In the Western science, the notion of ether was formulated by scientists where they started to research wave electromagnetic forms, and the wave means some environment. Something must be waved. Something must transmit these waves, and they said that in the vacuum, without air, there is some environment which can transmit these waves. And consequently, there was a notion in the Western science, which the notion of ether, and which it is quite close to to the Vedic notion from this verse. There is a space, and this space is the environment where some forms may appear. Namely, forms means forms on the level of the waves. Later, when Einstein stated that the speed of air in vacuum is stable, the notion of ether was denied by modern scientists. But as far as I know, modern scientists, they're coming back to the necessity of this notion, that there is some subtle element of ether which provides functioning or transmitting of waves in the distance. Now, of course, we are not talking about it. We are talking about the Vedic concept of ether, which is quite clearly says that the ether or space. There are various synonyms in Sanskrit for ether. One of the synonyms is ka, which means space. Another synonym is nabha. And the third synonym is, which is often used, is akash. All these are definitions of the one notion. And what is important here, it is said here that the ether or space gives place to functioning of the mind, feelings, and prana. And that finally mind, feelings, and prana have certain form. If they are in the space, it implies that they have certain forms, or they occupy some space. In other words, the mind, or as Srila Prabhupada says, that finally the mind, prana, and feelings, they take the forms of our body. That our body is the product of the more subtle energies, and the form of our body finally is defined by our mind. In the on the highest level is also, in a more narrow sense, is defined by prana, which is circulating in this body, or even blood, as Srila Prabhupada says in this purport. In other words, the mind, and this is what I wanted to talk today, mind, according to this purport and the verse, has a certain form. And Srila Prabhupada proves, illustrates this statement he illustrates this statement by the Lord Kapila by the statement of Bhagavad Gita, that finally the gross form which we get in the next life is depends on the subtle form of our mind at the moment of our death. The mind is not something formless. The mind needs a certain space to interact with prana, indriyas, and with the material world. And the mind is some subtle form of in the space which defines our gross body at this moment, and defines it will define our next gross body, depending on which form is occupied by the mind. Also, another consequence is if our mind will touch the spiritual energy and it will be able to take some spiritual form, then our next body will be spiritual, according to the form of our mind. The ether, which is the environment for transmitting the waves, it also forms or contains the body of our mind. And the consequences, there are several consequences from this. It means that the mind has a wave nature. If mind needs this space or akash ether to function and to touch the feeling, to contact our gross body, it means that the mind has this wave form, angular form, and it is proved by modern scientific data. And people started to research the waves of our brain.
Это же не у нас? Остальные картинки движутся?
Нет, да, Махараджа.
Подождем.
So scientists started to research these encephalographs before.
Матушка Нари, звук.
Давайте... обеспокоился, переносят мои волны к вам или не переносят по эфиру. Видите ли мою форму, перенесенную эфиром или нет?
Do you see my form transmitted by the ether?
Потому что я перестал видеть
Because I stopped seeing your forms.
В соответствии с этим стихом.
According to this verse of Shrimad Bhagavatam.
Так вот.
So,
еще раз.
Once again,
некая волновая природа
this waveform of the functioning of the mind,
связь того, что ум в основе своего функционирования
that mind has this angular form, and it is proved by not very precise research, but however the general state of mind is easily can be defined by encephalograph. If a person is agitated, then the frequency of the waves from his brain will start more, will become bigger. If a person is peaceful, then these waves also becomes different. You know this alpha waves, beta waves, stress waves, or the waves of the person which is calm. Beta waves and alpha waves are the intermediate state between the sleep and awakening, and also gamma waves, the waves of samadhi, when a person is in quite different state of mind. What does it really mean? There are many interesting consequences from that. One of them is The mind, according to the notions of yoga, may widen. Yogis say that not the mind itself, the function of mind, of vritti, or movement of the mind, or waves of the mind. It's a very interesting concept, which is formulated in Yoga Sutras of Patanjali Muni, where it is said that vritti, or the functions of the mind, they may widen, and also they may shrink. It means that the mind, depending on the external covering, it may either widen, going outside of the body and taking very wide forms, or it may shrink. There are interesting sutras in Yoga Sutras of Patanjali that the mind is widening when the external covering of karma is weakening. It's a very important statement which we need to understand. Why the mind is shrinking or living within this body? Because right now this mind is covered by samskaras which we got from previous lives, and this samskaras is the external layer which defines our body, the form of our gross body, and which defines the state of our mind. In other words, these samskaras are the wall, a certain wall, which separate my mind from other living beings. And as a result of yogic practice, it may be practice of bhakti yoga or usual yoga, regular yoga, if this covering becomes weaker, then the mind get the ability to go outside of the body. He can read the thoughts of other people, he may contact another person, or may even travel in ether. It may be separated from its body when this covering becomes very weak. And it's very interesting that what is said by yoga, they say that when a covering of karma, which keeps the mind inside and which shrinks the mind, when it weakens, as a result of this, the mind get the ability to illuminate. When this covering is weakening, a person starts to illuminate, and this is the lustre of the mind, the illumination of the subtle matter, of the waves of this mind which surrounds the body of the person. This is that very aura which is spoken of by which is quite famous. These are the waves of the mind which goes outside of our body and are spreading, and even they started to be visible. And also, so this shrinking and widening of the mind, or this, it correlates with the state of our consciousness. I told that by these electromagnetic waves in an encephalograph you may see the state of the consciousness, but yogis say about subtle things, We know that when the mind is outside of this body, when it is widening, when the element of sattva starts to dominate in the mind, then consequently a person starts to be happy. These are two symptoms of sattva guna. When Krishna mentioned in Bhagavad Gita, he says that sattva guna is characterized by feeling of happiness and the feeling of knowledge. A man gets knowledge as a result of sattva guna, and also he gets happiness. So the state of this widening mind, when the mind is widening, it is characterized by the feeling of happiness. And on the opposite statement is also right. When karma becomes very tight, and this covering of karma in the form of samskaras, sensual samskaras, which are left by interaction of our feelings with the objects, when it becomes very tight and solid, then the mind is shrinking. The mind is he gets the form of our body, and there is no aura outside of a person, and a person becomes unhappy. It's a very important thing that this state of our subjective feeling of happiness or unhappiness depends on the state of mind, if it's wide or if it's narrow. So the wide mind is the mind of a happy person, and it's not so easy to disbalance such a mind because it's wide. This mind widening and taking some big space. That's why happiness in Sanskrit means sukha. Kha means ether or the space. And when the mind becomes big, when it goes out of the body, when it includes other living beings, then at the same time, subjectively, a person feels happiness, sukha. He has a big, wide mind. And on the contrary, dukkha, kha means ether, and dukkha means a shrinked state of mind, which is defined by the mind is tightened by these samskaras. And we are speaking about this wide state of mind, or a state of a happy person, which implies the widening mind, and the state of the grasped mind. And this is what physically happens in our mind and in our consciousness. The mind is either under the influence of a real happiness or it's widening or shrinking. And yogis explain the very important thing in the comments to this sutra, which I mentioned, that these vrittis of mind, or functions of the mind, may widen. They speak what helps the mind to widen. Actually, it's a very simple thing, but at first glance it may think untrivial. If a person follows Dharma, then Dharma, or the testaments of Dharma, which is also said by Manu in the laws of Manu, following the testaments of Dharma, following the laws of Dharma, leads to this state of widening of the mind. And on the contrary, when a person breaks dharma or follows adharma, when person breaks the laws of breaks the universal laws of balance, then the result is that its mind starts to shrink, and this shrinking of mind subjectively feels as unhappiness. So in the end, finally, it's a very interesting consequence. It's maybe not new, but still, from this point of view of this verse, it's quite important. Dharma, all actions are allowed by sacred scriptures, they lead to widening of the mind and more illuminated, and a person feels happiness. Adharma leads to the contrary results. The mind is shrinking, person feels unhappiness, and a person feels anxiety. Another interesting consequence from this statement when a person is in this widening state of mind, when it is a result of yoga practice, of following Dharma, he achieved this balanced state of mind, then it's very difficult to disbalance this person. And he is not paying attention to trifles. One of the characteristics of the person with narrow mind, they are just they overreact. They tend to overreact. They make the small things very big. They make the elephant out of the fly, because the state of mind is very narrow, and that's why they can see only trifles. And when people, when the mind is wide, that such people, they see a wider picture, and they can easily and if the mind is narrow, then I overreact to somebody's words, and I dramatize everything that happens in my life, because this trifle filled the narrow space of my mind, this one-room apartment of my mind. In other words, this ability to make the elephant out of the fly is the manifestations of the narrow mind. And on the contrary, a person with the wide mind, he is not dramatizing trifles. And his ability to see wide context is a very important characteristics of the wide mind. This is why yogis, they connect these two things. They say that jnana is the state of the pure mind. This is also very interesting result, conclusion. According to philosophy of Bhagavad Gita and philosophy of yoga, what is knowledge? Knowledge is not information. Unfortunately, in the modern world, at our times, this information is mixed with knowledge. But actually, the knowledge from the point of view of yoga or Bhagavad Gita is the state of a pure mind, which is under the influence of sattva guna. Knowledge is a natural state which comes to a pure person who purified his mind. He doesn't need to study some dictionaries, encyclopedias. The knowledge is a natural state. which comes when the is widening and occupying more space and occupying this bigger space, it starts to include other things, and he is not fixed on itself and starts to include other things and starts to see these connections. This narrow mind and wide mind, the narrow mind, it cannot go really far. He only sees immediate reasons. And scientists, which are who are proud by their mind, they are not really intelligent because their mind doesn't go far. They are trying to find some immediate reasons, and they deny the cause of all causes. They cannot include the cause of all causes into their understanding and into their worldview. They say that it's enough for us to study some immediate reason. And this narrowness of the consciousness leads to many problems. For example, modern medicine is a product of this narrow consciousness, which sees only immediate causes and tries to solve the immediate causes of diseases, not seeing the wider picture of the cause and effect. But this is a natural consequence of the narrow mind. And narrow mind, as we said, is very, very important, which I wanted to tell. The narrow mind is the result of karma. Narrow mind is the result of wrong interaction of our feelings with the objects of feelings. This correct interaction of our feelings with objects of senses calls dharma. Dharma is allowed forms of interactions between our feelings and the objects of our senses. They don't narrow our consciousness. On the contrary, they help to widen this consciousness. And there are forbidden interactions of the senses and the objects of senses, which gives the illusion of happiness. Illusions of happiness means that at this moment when our senses contacted a certain object of senses, our mind for some time artificially widens, because, as we said, the state of happiness is a state of a widening mind. But if it's artificial widening, then at the same moment when senses stop to interact with the objects of senses, then mind becomes shrinked. It shrinks quite quickly and even becomes even more narrow than it was before. And that's why dependencies appear. This is a very interesting consequence from this verse. I am now in the regime of brainstorm, and I'm speaking about this potential cause of the future research. If we understand that our mind is functioning in the space, and its functioning is defined by the waves, and the vritti of the mind is waves in the ether, then another consequence from this is that attempts to artificially get happiness and of the forbidden interaction with some objects of senses, which gives the illusion of happiness. As a result of this illusion, the mind widens, then it shrinks even more than it was before, and then person have this need to artificially widen this mind, and each time this artificial widening is less than it the first time, and the shrinkage is more than it was. So a person becomes more and more unhappy, and that's why people, they start to take drugs, not to become happy, but just for some moment to get rid of this unhappiness which they created for themselves as a result of this forbidden interaction of the senses and the objects of the senses. So, to some extent, it explains the mechanism of appearance of dependencies and some addictions. So let's continue the most important thought. The mind is, the width of the mind really depends on the covering of the karma. Depends on the width of this covering of ignorant karma. When a person, as a result of following dharma, of following some principles of yoga, as a result of internal meditation, because the mind gives the space for external activity and also for internal activity. When the covering of karma becomes weaker, then the mind of the person is widening. In this sutra which I was told about, from Yoga Sutras, Patanjali, it is said that the covering of karma becomes less as a result of pranayama. It's a very interesting thing, because what is pranayama? Pranayama is an attempt to widen the area of our prana, or vital air, which is connected with the mind in this space, in this akash. As it is said in this verse of Shrimad Bhagavatam. And this pranayama helps to take away these ignorant impressions which comprise our karma. And the most important thing, what is ultimate covering of our karma, which puts restrictions to our mind, is the covering of our ego. Because finally, all samskaras which we get from the past lives, all deep samskaras which were transformed into vasanas, very deep samskaras, and they define our mental tendencies and all the rest, all together they unite and get the form of our ego. And this ego is false ego, ahankara, is, according to the philosophy of Sankhya, which was explained by Kapiladev, is the sprout of tamaguna, and this covering made of mode of ignorance and samskaras of our sense impressions from past lives. This is the main reason why we cannot widen our mind, why we are suffering, because of which we are unhappy and we are in stress, and which makes us selfish. What I wanted to say, that if a person gets outside of its ahankara, this ignorant covering, then his mind is connected with Mahatattva, his consciousness connects with Mahatattva. And there are various means to get rid of this ignorant covering and ahankara. One of them I told this pranayama, but you see that this is a weak method. We know the method to get rid of ahankara, which would solve all our problems, originated from our narrow mind. This method is chanting the holy name in the humble state of consciousness. When the Lord Chaitanya Mahaprabhu recommended this third verse of Shikshashtakam to practice, and the third verse is actually the brief statement of Bhajana Kriya. Bhajana Kriya is our attempts to chant holy name humbly and also worshipping everyone, not wishing worshipping from others. And this is the most powerful method to weaken this ignorant covering of ahankara and influence of tamas on our mind, and to put our mind outside of the narrow understanding of reality which he lives in under the influence of ahankara, and finally to include into this understanding the Lord, to get the real experience of God, not to transform God into some distorted picture in our mind of the small apartment of our mind. We invited the God and he is small here, he's sitting here being very small, but on the contrary, when our mind is wide and we got the experience of interacting with God. And the third verse of Shikshashtakam is a powerful instrument in our hands. If we want to become happy, if we want to widen our knowledge, if we want to illuminate, if we want to read thoughts of other people, I don't know who wants this. If we want many other things to get, we must follow this verse of Shikshashtaka. And this led us to reflect the spiritual form in our mind, and in the end to get outside of this restricting material form, material body and material mind, and to achieve a spiritual form which is absolutely free, which may communicate in the world of freedom with free God. But for this we have to follow also principles of Dharma and so on. I just, in the mode of brainstorm, I just gave many consequences from this verse. Thank you very much.
Преданные, пожалуйста, вопросы. Пожалуйста, идите на
Святейшество, примите поклоны. Очень хочется стать немножко более кха, посчастливее. По роду своей профессиональной деятельности я преподаю даже больше наркологию, психиатрию. И то, что вы описываете, сам процесс вот в рамках мозгового штурма очень резонирует с тем, что происходит вот в этой наркологической реальности. То есть сначала изменяется вкус психологическое, затем меняется реактивность тела, и затем происходит некая борьба. Она проявляется в психозах, например, да, в том числе одержимости, меняется физиология. И по сути мы говорим о том, как разворачивается в обратную сторону весь этот локомотив тела, ума и эго и дальше. Вопрос этой самскары, двух волков, борющихся, да, кого кормить. Мое наблюдение, что есть люди, которым один шаг назад вернуться, это уже какой-то большой прогресс. Ну, то есть есть вот эти пределы жесткие. И есть наблюдение также, что ну вот на пути преданного служения, когда я в частности стараюсь отойти от старых привычек, они дают бой, и это определенная работа по переработке вот этих самскар, которые облепили. Я сейчас пытаюсь понять конкретную точку приложения вот этих наблюдений своих. Есть группа с наркоманами, есть группа с зависимостью от алкоголя, есть просто привычки бытовые, может быть, да, есть и начинающий уровень преданных, я уж не знаю, насколько это можно параллельно в одну сторону ставить, но тем не менее процессы я вижу более-менее похожие. Более-менее. Вопрос вкусов.
Да, механизм один и тот же.
The mechanism is the same. A person is attached to certain samskara, and any experience of happiness which I got, I may learn. A person is learning. He learns to get a certain happiness with the help of some actions. I wanted to tell one small case from not from my life, from the life of my disciples who used heavy drugs. 3 times he was almost dying, and he was saved 3 times. He was serious drug addicted. He had a heroin addiction and also overdoses of these drugs. From the point of view of modern science or narcology, he was on the stage of uncurable. He said that when he started to chant Hare Krishna Mahamantra, it just was washed away. He said that I can't believe in it. Everything just was left almost immediately, and I started to think how it happened, because we know that not all people have such a happy ends. Many devotees are chanting Maha Mantra for 30 years, and they can't even stop smoking. And the question was about this drug addiction, how to overcome it. And I think that the secret of this transformation, is in the jump outside of our ego. When a person, maybe because of some humility which he got as a result of his difficult life, or maybe due to some other things, he was very sincerely accepted it outside of the ego. It's a very interesting thing. Sadhu Maharaj often speaks about the differences. Yesterday he had a lecture for you, and he said there's a difference between the spiritual and religious consciousness. As far as I understood, if we try to define them in categories of what we were speaking of, religious consciousness is an attempt to include spiritual truths into the narrow limits of our ego, to put them there, to domesticize these concepts, to make them usual, and to live in our usual reality, just to add some icons. So we are making garlands for them, and that's all. So the person making rituals, but there is a principle, another approach. When I don't try to accept spiritual truths with my ego, to filter them through my ego and to make them a part of my material conditioning, of my material identity, but I tried to go outside of my ego. I'm not satisfied with the ego. I try to go outside of my restricted sphere of my ego, and I use spiritual practice as a method of go outside of my ego, to go outside of my limited consciousness. And then the same religious practice becomes really spiritual, and it's more powerful. And its results are more powerful, because when I even chant the holy name in the limits of my ego, this is the 10th offense. I'm chanting holy name offensively because I still, for me, the basis is I and mine, if it's good or bad for me. I'm always turning back to that prison of my ego. But when I try to chant the holy name in a different state of mind, refusing, denying my ego from the beginning, saying that I'm not the body, I'm not the mind, I'm a soul, and I want to serve everyone, I want to serve all particles of the Lord, then this spiritual practice becomes much more powerful, and quite quickly it may bring the person outside of the limits of this prisoning or covering from which made of some scars and of the ego.
Я, похоже, уже все свои лимиты. Да, Нари. Только у вас отключен микрофон, Нари. Вы зря шевелите губами.
У нас были заминки.
Я все равно не слышу. Не слышу,
Кто меня
громче говорит. Да, сейчас слышно. Да.
Я говорю, что у нас были заминки, поэтому мы восполняем это пропущенное время. У нас есть еще 5 минут. Можно я по этому поводу задам вопрос, если не То есть вот такой момент. Причиной...
Очень плохо вас слышно, ваши волны не попадают.
Сейчас меня будет... Вот что произошло. То есть считается, что... Вернее, мы знаем, что причиной переноса...
So my question is that the reason of transmitting a person from mind to mind, there is the state of mind.
Бывает, вернее, есть такой момент, когда ум соприкасается
And the mind may...
Вот можно просто чисто визуально, что в этом случае происходит с нашим тонким телом,
What happens with our subtle body?
причиной переноса нас в другое тело? Что происходит,
what happens, how it is transformed? Can we imagine it?
Ну, во-первых, что происходит при этом? Капила Дев объясняет это.
Kapila Dev explains
Он говорит,
it.
что тонкое тело переваривается.
Переваривается?
That the subtle body is digested.
То есть эти оболочки, которые покрывают душу, и прежде всего оболочка Аханкара, они начинают
And the covering of Ahankara started to be digested. Kapila Dev says that he compares spiritual practice with the fire of digestion. Just like the food, independently on our consciousness is digested when we eat it, then the subtle body in contact with with the soul and the spiritual energy in the form of the holy name and philosophy of Shrimad Bhagavatam and Vaishnavas, it starts to be digested gradually. So it just starts to weaken. This is what Patanjali Muni said in Yoga Sutras. This covering starts to be weakened, and it is fully digested in the end. The covering of the mind and intelligence, it is digested. What happens visually? Chitta stays. The mind, intelligence, and ahankara, which are the consequences of tamasic ahankara, they are digested, and chitta, purified chitta, which the Lord Chaitanya was said in the first verse of Shikshashtakam, this purified chitta comes back into its original state. It is enlightened. It really has a form of light. This chitta is illuminating, it's light and it's peaceful, and it may reflect. Now this reflection ability, due to these coverings, it still works, but these reflections of material world which we get in chitta, they are distorted because they all have to come through this filter, and from this filter of ego, which distorts them. When we start to reflect reality adequately as it is outside of our ego, when we see, as Srila Prabhupada defined Bhagavad Gita is as it is, it means Bhagavad Gita without false ego, accepted without false ego. When we start to see reality like this, then this chitta gets the ability to reflect spiritual reality. Because this is the most subtle covering of the soul, then at first the person starts to realize its spiritual nature, and its spiritual nature is reflected in this chitta, and he starts to see it. And moreover, this chitta gets the ability to reflect also the forms of the Lord. It still it is the carrier of the forms. Chitta has some form, but when it is in contact with spiritual energy, it starts to identify itself with spiritual energy, and the forms of spiritual world, including our own natural form, Svarupa, and the form of the Lord are reflected in Chitta, and we get this new body, new spiritual body. When you're saying digesting, do you mean that they are transformed or they are just disappearing? The word which is used here is they are just
Бхакти растворяет эти вещи, Бхакти растворяет эти тонкие формы. То есть, что это значит реально? Я сейчас попытаюсь объяснить. Это сравнение не случайно.
Bhakti decompose these subtle forms. When we digest the food, what happens with the food? The food digesting in our stomach, on one hand, it some needless things, they are going out of our body. Chandogya Upanishad says that the food which we eat, it is divided into three parts. One part becomes our energy, another part becomes our mind, and the third part is going out. The same happens with subtle body. Needless things of the subtle body, they are going out. All anarthas, they're in the process of this digestion, they're digested and they're going out as toxic things. But needed things, what is practice of bhakti? Practice of bhakti is also based on some samskaras. Our mind and our body, they interact with spiritual objects, and we get spiritual samskaras, and these spiritual samskaras, they become a part of our spiritual body. Useful things in the process of digestion of the subtle body, they stay and they include into our spiritual body.
Спасибо огромное. Да, очень все наглядно и замечательно. Спасибо вам большое. Пожалуйста, Виджа Говинда Прабhu. Это последний вопрос.
Не, у нас еще есть один.
Есть еще один? Да, хорошо. Два вопроса. Пожалуйста, Прабhu, да.
Thank you very much for a very interesting lecture. Could you please mention how this topic of the waveform of the mind, how it is connected with the three levels of the sound? This topic is for another, because the sound in ether is the main element from which ether appears. Srila Prabhupada says about it in the previous purport, where it is said that the sound in the ether produces the ether. It means that the sound gets the great ability to influence our mind. When we chant certain transcendental sounds like Om or Hare Krishna mantra, then immediately we put our mind in contact with this sound, because the sound is in ether and mind starts to harmonizing with this vibration. And on the contrary, vice versa, dirty sounds which has traces of low energies or low samskaras, such as filthy language, they immediately contaminate our mind and narrow our mind. And as long as the sound becomes more and more subtle, at first this is a gross sound, Vaikarika Vak, then it is a Madhyama Vak, then it is Pashyanti Vak, and in the end this is Paravak. As long as the sound is purifying and becomes more and more subtle, and then the mind is also purified more and more. We may chant the mantra on the level of Vaikarika Vak or a gross sound. We may chant the mantra on the level of our heart, on the level of Anahata chakra, where Madhyama Vak is sounding, or a voice of our thoughts. We may chant it on the level of Pashyanti Vak, which which is on the Manipura chakra. And in the end, from this sound, we may leave this world and go back to the spiritual world. But this is just a separate topic.
Спасибо большое. И
Thank you
еще
very
один
much.
вопрос.
Спасибо. Да, спасибо большое за лекцию. У нас есть вопрос из трансляции в Ютубе. Сейчас его зачитаю. Как объяснить болезни с точки зрения сужения ума?
How to explain illnesses from the point of view of narrowing the mind. What happens when the marrow becomes narrow? Then all waves which happen there, they get a chaotic character. Just imagine a small aquarium and a big fish in this aquarium. It will make big waves and many anxieties. And the same fish, if it lives in a big lake, then it will just peacefully swim there. So narrow mind is very sensitive to all external signals. Any external signal, any external anxiety, anything which is happening outside, it's quite easily immediately disbalance the mind, and this disbalanced mind, where it influences our gross body, and also body becomes disbalanced. Kapha, Vata and Pitta, all these subtle doshas, because they all are connected with the mind. And the wide mind, it's very difficult to disbalance it because it's wide. Outside signals, somebody is offending us, but we don't care because our mind is wide. This is a fish, it's just swimming and swimming, and we don't care. We still feel all right. And in this state, in this resource state, when the mind is wide, it's much more difficult to disbalance a person. It doesn't get in the stress, because stress, what is stress? Stress is all these waves or anxieties which appear because of our restricted ego. Stress directly connected with our ego. Me, I'm acting. And this produces waves, and the stress is the origin of all diseases. When we get rid of this, then we get rid of diseases, because all diseases, they have a psychosomatic nature, and this narrow mind is very easy. It's easy to agitate it.
Спасибо. Федор Прабhu, удовлетворены ответом? Спасибо вам, дорогой Махарадж.
Thank you very much. We were so happy to see you. Wishing you all the best. And tomorrow is your birthday. Everyone is celebrating your Vyasa Puja, and we also congratulate you. And wishing you health and all the best, and want to see you. I'm very happy to see you all. Thank you. Hare Krishna.